Rome. Italy's mountains are not as rugged as Greece's, so that helped Italy unite. Italy's land is more fertile than Greece's. Rome was located like in the center of the western part of Italy. It was located not on the seacoast, and a lot of people believe that they located 50 miles inland to protect them from tidal waves, which were a big problem. No tidal wave has ever penetrated the city of Rome. And also it was located far enough inland that no pirate would dare go 50 miles up a river, because he knew that if the big navy cut him off, he had no way to escape except abandon ship and hit the land. And most of them did not want to be trapped in a river. Rome is located on the Tiber River, and situated on 7 hills. It's called the City of 7 Hills. It's also called the Eternal City. It's located along a shallow part of the river, making it easy to cross, make it easy to build bridges across. I'll leave this part out. We don't know much about Rome's original inhabitants, or Latins, from which we get the language called Latin. The Etruscans moved in, the Greeks moved in. According to tradition, Rome was founded by 2 twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, but Romulus killed Remus. And again, according to tradition, these 2 boys were abandoned. This is a big issue in the ancient world. If the parents didn't want you, they'd simply take you out and throw you out to the wild and let nature have you. And young babies would often starve to death. In fact, the Spartans were told, if your baby doesn't look healthy, throw it to the wild, whether it be a boy or a girl. If you don't want the baby, throw it to the wild. These 2 boys were thrown to the wild, and some wolves bought them and raised them up. Now, folks, this is not as far-fetched as sound. We have at least some 25 documented cases of young children who have been reared up by wolves. And when these children are found, they oftentimes show no sign of any mental or physical impairment for having gone through the experience of being brought up by wolves. If you visit Rome, Georgia, nearby, there'll be a statue of a she-wolf taking care of 2 twin boys, if any of you have seen it. I've asked students to show their hands, but sad, nobody seems to have it. Rome is a city nearby here that has a statue of this made out of bronze. A lot of Livy's stories, again, this is a problem. Livy wrote much of what we have found about the period. His stories are not believed today. Again, because they involve a whole lot of supernatural stories about giants and what we might call fairy tales. Your book once had the story of Cincinnatus, but it's not been included in today's book, so don't worry about it. It will not be on the test. Make a long story short, Rome eventually conquered all of Italy. When they conquer a city-state, they'd approach them and say, be our ally, and they'd build a road between their city and the conquered city, and it became a saying, all roads lead to Rome. They're good roads. Some of them are still in service, but the good roads enabled people to travel quickly from one city to another. Just follow the road, and again, if you don't have a road, folk, a lot of your time is spent trying to figure out which way to go. And without landmarks, they train you in the army. Follow a compass or follow some landmarks. If you're not, everybody walks with taking one step short. You're going to wind up going in a big circle and wind up back where you started from. But again, the roads helped to solve that problem. Roads also were enabled to carry carts. Eventually, by diplomacy, persistence, opportunism, they were able to unite in one city-state after another and get control of all of Italy. They had a class struggle between the patricians and plebeians. They eventually resulted in patricians and plebeians getting together, and plebeians being allowed to say so in government, and plebeian and patricians being allowed to intermarry. Then they had to fight a series of wars between them and Carthage. Now, I've already mentioned how that Rome would try to placate its enemies. They eventually ran into an enemy. Carthage was on the other side of the Mediterranean, by the way. They ran into an enemy they could not placate. These people were, they would not quit fighting. The wars lasted more than 100 years. There were 3 big wars between the second and third, maybe 50 years apart. And finally, to make a long story short, the Romans had to go in, burn the city down, plow up all the ground, and put salt in the ground to make sure it would not produce anymore. Carthage was eventually rebuilt. But all this, by the way, all the people of Carthage were sold into slavery. And it said, we're going to make sure this city is not rebuilt. And it was the only way they could deal with these people who just simply would not quit fighting, keep coming at you, keep coming at you. And they had to do what they had not done to their own Italian people, go in and utterly destroy them. Now, Rome, like Greece, started out with 7 kings. They eventually rebelled against their kings and formed a democracy, or they called it a republic. Very important because the republic eventually gave way to a empireship. Eventually it gave way to a kingship again. But it went in cycles. Anyway, you can go into more detail on what happened. A lot of persons have said that the United States is following in the footsteps of the Roman Empire. And folks, the very first term paper I did, I was a junior in high school when that topic enamored me, so I wrote about it. And I've asked you to write something similar, if you will. Anyway, the Romans had an office called a Senate, and the people who had the office were called senators. The Romans used a dome for their capital buildings. We use domes for our capital buildings. And Rome had a democracy for a while, which gave way to rule by one person. Now, the Gracchus brothers, essentially, what I remember about these 2 boys, young men, they both wanted to take government lands and take public lands and give these lands to the poor, redistribution of wealth. They are looked on as being noble people, but folk, this has been tried time and time throughout history, including our southern neighbor Mexico tried it one time. They had a dictator who took lands from the rich to give the poor. The Chinese tried it, the Koreans tried it. In every case, it has not worked. Don't ask me all the reasons why. Basically, it's redistribution. In 90% of the cases, take a poor person, give him $1 million, within a couple of years he'll be flat broke. The reason he doesn't have $1 million to begin with is he didn't know how to manage it in the first place. I say this on a very personal note before I kind of feel bad about what I'm saying. I grew up in poverty, but even as a kid I realized a lot of the poverty I had to endure was due to my father's own bad management. He eventually got better. Yes, I feel really badly about saying that, but nevertheless, I have to kind of get it off my chest. And a lot of the poverty that we see around the world today is due to your bad economic system or due to people who simply will not or cannot discipline and control themselves, save up, work hard. I mean, in some societies, people on their way to work, there was a sort of fish trap. And on their way to work, they're open to look at the trap. There's a fish inside. I've got a fish. You don't have to go to work today. Well, why don't they go ahead and take the fish home and go to work and have the fish and save the money that they won't have to spend for food because no, they don't see it that way. They just want to live a humdrum day-to-day existence, hand to mouth, and this is all the life they've known, all they're going to know. And again, if you give them $1 million, within a couple of years, they've lost it. Any of you, well, maybe you younger folk might not know what I'm talking about, but if you don't, you probably will. But anyway, the Gracchus brothers were not welcomed by the Senate. They were both members of the Senate. Make a long story short, they were both assassinated. The older one first, then the younger one. I did not mention Solon, but Solon would not redistribute. One of the things that goes to his credit, in my way of thinking. Now, eventually, you have a Roman general who made the troops swear loyalty to him. Now, folks, I joined the United States Army once, and I put my hand on the Bible and raised my right hand toward heaven and swore to defend the United States. I swore to the United States. I did not swear to President Jimmy Carter, who was president at that time. I told me all the way. No, but the United States, to defend the United States. I did not swear to General Hillsman, who was a 2-star general at the time he became my general when I was up in training, or to the general at the time, General Scott, who was the general of the National Guard in Georgia. No, But Marius raised an army and had the troops swear loyalty to him. Very, very dangerous. In other words, I swear to follow General Marius wherever he goes. Very dangerous. Then he promised his troops land. Well, to get the land, they promised the troops. They had to play politics, and the other generals. But eventually, what it resulted in, the power wound up being in the hands of the generals. Very dangerous. Sulla was also a general. Sulla and Marius fought each other, and Sulla won. Unfortunately, Sulla did not live long enough to become a dictator. But what happened was 3 men started fighting each other, Crassus, Pompey, and Julius. Julius we know of as Julius Caesar. For a while they got along together, but inevitably Crassus was killed in a battle. Pompey and Julius fought it out with Julius winning, and the Roman Republic was over with. Julius Caesar became the dictator. Which again, I have a note here about democracy. Democracy failed. Julius Caesar became the dictator. But the Roman Senate got together and they assassinated him one day. They made a plot, some 30 of them, and they said, we're going to put daggers under our cloaks, from whence comes the term cloak and dagger. So they got the Senate and they had it all planned, and they said, now, 5 of us, you 5, you get behind him, whichever way he's facing, and you 5 get on his right side, and you 6 or 7 get on his left side, and the rest of us get in the front. And when I say a certain sentence, on that sentence we all pull out our daggers and lunge. So at the right time, they all pulled out their daggers and lunged at him. Caesar's last words, he saw that Brutus was among those attacking. He said, "Et tu, Brute," was that you too, Brutus? Then he just bowed his head and resigned himself. He initially tried to defend himself, but he realized he could not fight himself. His friends, none of them had daggers. So there was a civil war. His nephew Octavian took charge, and the other man was Mark Antony. Cleopatra, who had been Julius Caesar's wife, married Mark Antony, believing he'd win. She married wrong. Mark Antony lost. Octavian won. Both Cleopatra and Mark Antony died. Cleopatra by letting a poisonous snake kill her. She believed that would make her their god. Cleopatra then became the last pharaoh. Mark Antony also committed suicide. Which led to the age of Augustus. Octavian was another name for Augustus. Augustus was to rule for 45 years. He's remembered, among other things, being the ruler when Jesus was born. He ruled almost as an autocrat, but he tried to rule according to the Roman Constitution because he recalled what had happened to Julius Caesar. Now, he set up the Praetorian Guard, and he told these guards, you be my bodyguards, you follow me wherever I go, even inside the Senate. So the the Praetorian Guard would go fully armed in the Senate, and this self-protect. To where there were very few, well, for several generations, there were very few assassinations of an emperor. Now, there came a period of time where emperors were assassinated right and left. With his rule, peace came about for the first time in generations, and the Roman people welcomed the peace. Augustus realized that his empire was declining. He tried to limit the amount of money one could spend on a party. He tried to outlaw adultery, but these laws were enforced. Oh yeah, he taxed unmarried people. Now, as time went on in Rome, and this is something I brought out in a paper many years ago, the Romans, most of them were married, most of them had children, and divorce was very rare. But then, as Romans got richer, divorce became more common. A lot of young men and women just did not get married at all. There became a big increased number of bachelors and a number of old maids. Now, do we see any of that going on in our country today? Half of it, and in some cases 2/3 of the adult population of big cities are unmarried. And children, we greatly limit the amount of children we have. Caesar Augustus tried to curb this by taxing people who had no children, then taxing the unmarried. Again, this did not really stop the situation. I want to say this about divorce. In looking for a marriage partner, we prize highly three things: looks, personality, and money. Now, I want to tell you a secret. Not any one of those three have anything at all to do with making a marriage work. If you don't believe it, just ask Ted Turner. Just ask, if you could, ask Jane Mansfield, Elizabeth Taylor. They have all three of those. The richer a person is, the more likely he or she is divorced. And folk, I didn't get married, I was 39, and I joined the singles group one time, and some of the most attractive women I ever saw were divorced. If you don't know what I'm talking about yet, you might eventually. But anyway, they you can make up your mind for yourself, but you hopefully you'll keep his mind. After Caesar Augustus died, after a long rule, Tiberius took over. He was the emperor during the public rule of the public career of Christ. Nero, his name has become a symbol of tyranny. And if you see on the multiple choice test 2 of the 5 good emperors, if you see Nero as a choice, go on to another choice. He was known for persecuting the Christians. Nero was a member of the royal family, but he never thought of himself as being emperor. And in fact, he never would have gotten to be emperor. But the ones ahead of him all died off. And then one day the emperor himself died, and he was told, "Hey, you're the emperor." "Oh, me? Yeah, you're emperor." Well, they brought him a paper and said, "This is an execution order. This man has done some good, and you must sign. You mean if I sign this man's going to die?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. This is what you have to do when you're emperor." The first time he signed an execution order, he said, "I wish I'd have never learned to write." But then he got to where he was hardened against it. He was signing execution orders right and left, killing everyone who stood in his way. Finally, though, when the people had stood him as long as they could, he committed suicide, saying, "What an artist dies in me." An artist. Yeah, he wanted to be an artist, but instead fate made him an emperor. The problem he had, it might not have been so much he was evil as much as he just simply was incompetent. Now, again, that's something we don't know for sure. He might have just plain been evil also. Or maybe the power made him evil when he otherwise wouldn't have been. Eventually, emperors began to hand the power over to their sons when they died. At first, they tried to avoid it, but they tried to avoid the semblance of it, but eventually, the Roman empireship became hereditary. Until you get to the 5 good emperors, these emperors ruled for a period of 70 years, 5 of them, and Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Now, Marcus Aurelius, you'll see that name in some Hollywood movies. He's caught in the popular fancy somewhat. Now, these were not father and son. Rather, they were father and adopted son. These men would adopt some promising, good-looking young boy and make him and groom him to be the next emperor. This was to go on to Marcus Aurelius, and in Marcus Aurelius' case, his actual son took the throne, and it was the worst mistake that Rome ever made. But they would adopt young boys and bypass their own sons and give the throne to this promising young boy who they had brought up and groomed for the job. But they built a lot of roads, aqueducts. Some of these are still in service. They carry water into the city, amphitheaters, bridges, harbors, peace and prosperity, trade flourished. Rome seemed to have no enemies. They boasted of a period called Roman peace. Now, I want to say this about peace, folks, as much as I hate to say it. Sometimes mankind's greatest enemy appears to be peace and prosperity. During this time, there were few, if any, plagues, no wars, and the people became complacent, lazy, unproductive, and in general, the population dropped drastically. I had a student say, "Oh, the population just moved from city to country." Not necessarily. What actually happened was simply the population just simply declined, owing to the fact that Roman women would not have children, or rarely did, or very seldom. Also, the men and women did not like each other. That is the case too. I go on to describe the Roman poets. I'll tell you what, don't worry about these names for right now. Just leave them off. Tacitus made a few references to Jesus Christ, all negative. Cicero, now I do remember, when the other richer people in Rome all had their own army, and folk, this was something else. I mean, if you can imagine all the rich men in a country having his own army and his own troops, the chaos would be. Cicero said the army should belong only to the state, and he wouldn't have one. See, the reason Julius Caesar conquered, he had his own army. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Mark Antony, all these men had their own armies. Cicero wouldn't have an army. It was said that when Cicero spoke in the Senate, Julius Caesar trembled. What was on Julius Caesar, among other things, might have been paranoid, but also Julius Caesar told about how wonderful democracy was and how that no man should have an absolute amount of power. And Julius Caesar knew that Cicero was talking about him and that the whole Senate agreed with him. He had reason to tremble. Like I say, eventually some senators rose up and killed him while he was on his way to a Senate meeting. The arch, the vault, and the dome, all these. Rome wrote its laws on 12 tables, and they believed that by rational thinking you could determine what natural law was. Basically, it's similar to the United States, where we believe people have what Thomas just called unalienable rights. That we knew, that everybody knew what natural law was, and again, similar to the United States belief in rights. The family was originally male-dominated. Marriages often occurred early. Again, life was short in those days. At first, divorce was uncommon, but then came the wars. At one time, the war was just a matter of you marched to the nearby city-state 50 miles away, and when it was over, you marched back home. But then they started fighting wars overseas, and the wars would last 20 years, not just in one season. And during the time they were gone, a lot of times the man would come back and find his wife had married someone else, or she'd had a couple of children with some other man while he was gone, and or the man would come home crippled for life, unable to work, having been wounded in battle, and they had no way to really take care of him. So a lot of times the man would come home and find his farm in a bad state of repair because his wife and daughters had not been able to keep it up. His son was in the army with him, and it put a strain on family life. Again, with divorce being common. With the wealthy, as I already said, most likely to divorce. Eventually, the male being the head of the family declined. Caesar Augustus tried to stem the trend, but it did not work. The women began to be elevated. The wars, probably the men were gone, the women became more independent, and they were to assert their independence after the wars were over. And we find this in our own history after World War II. I mean, during World War II, women began to do things that formerly only men could do. The women began to take over the factories and do a lot of the factory work. And herpes was a problem, and they all knew how it spread. Caesar Augustus tried to stem the spread of this disease, but again, his efforts failed. The most famous slave uprising was Spartacus's rebellion. In 1970, I believe there was a movie made about it. Have any of you happened to see it? Called Spartacus? That's an old movie. I saw it one time. All of Spartacus's followers were crucified. As the wars ended, there were fewer and fewer slaves, and eventually slaves were able to gain their freedom. And after a while, the slaves that were left in master's home were not replaced. And that meant that the wife had to do the work that was formerly done by slaves. And it was a terrible adjustment for a lot of women to make. There became a large gap between the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, which is typical. And eventually the poor got to where they were completely dependent on the state. The Romans would feed the poor, and again, welfare, public welfare, and it's called bread and circuses. give them food and entertainment, and they'll be happy. And regrettably, this trend of bread and circus started with Caesar Augustus. What he should have done was try to get these people to work. Instead, he encouraged idleness without him meaning to. There was almost no middle class, so it was basically the person was either born in extreme poverty or born to extreme wealth. The Emperor Caracalla in 212 made everyone citizens. Gladiatorial shows, that was a part of entertainment. Now, again, I made reference to these things when I was writing my paper back in 1965. The Romans loved brutality in sports. They'd get two gladiators fighting with real swords, and when the fight was over, the one would be down, the winner would put his neck on the loser and look at the crowd. If the crowd said thumbs up, the winner would draw and let the loser live. If the crowd said thumbs down, the winner was expected to thrust the loser through with a sword. They would also put lions in cages, and then turn the lions loose after starving a few days. Turn the lions loose, and the lions would tear people to pieces in front of a lot of crowd of spectators. Eventually, due to the influence of Christianity, the gladiatorial shows were stopped. But at one point, very few people spoke against them. Even Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus attended. Now, into this scenario came Christianity. Christianity started out in Judea, where the Jews had returned to their homeland. They fought the Greeks for independence, but they did not make the people happy, so the Jews spread all over the earth, all over the Western world, that is. And everywhere they spread, they would tell their neighbors that they believed the Messiah was coming, that they only believed in one God, but they did not try to make converts. They would set up a synagogue everywhere they went, and all this was eventually paved the way for Christianity that came later. Then Jesus of Nazareth came, and he was the founder of Christianity. Now, folks, this is one time I will say I don't really want to debate. Jesus' followers believed that he died and rose from the dead. Whether or not he did is beyond the subject of a course like this when it's more for theology class. But the fact, what's important though, is that his followers have believed for the last 2,000 years he rose from the dead, and this belief was to change the whole course of Western civilization. They called him the Messiah, the Anointed One. Now, for the most part, the Jews have never accepted that Jesus was their anointed Messiah. Christians have. That's the difference between Christianity and Judaism. The Christians believe Jesus was the Messiah. Jews do not. Anyway, after Jesus left the earth, he had 7 disciples who spread his message, but the main one was Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul. Paul wrote much of what was to become Christian doctrine. Very important you know his name because most of the New Testament was written by Paul. The religion was persecuted at first, and that was strange because paganism supposedly tolerated all religions except for Druidism. But Christianity was persecuted at first. With Nero, the emperors began persecuting it. And from Nero's time, for the next 230 or so years, Christianity was persecuted in waves, on and off. Some emperors did not persecute them much, and some did, for 300 years. Then, eventually in 312, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. When Constantine had a dream, by this sign conquer, and Constantine went on to take over the office, but winning the battle the next day. Several reasons. I mean, you can read it for yourself. One of the reasons, and this is hardly mentioned, but one of the reasons that Christianity, probably was Christians lived noticeably longer than anyone else. Typically, pagans only lived an average of 20-some years, 22, 23 years, owing to high infant mortality and also excessive partying and drinking. Eating, they would do binge eating, then they'd go to the bathroom, regurgitate, and go back and binge some more, go back to regurgitate. It may sound gross, but this is the way a lot of them lived. Christians did not practice this. And the result is the average Christian lived more than 50 years, which was noticeably longer. Also, Christians did not abandon each other during the plagues. And it's known that a person who was cared for during a plague had a 50-50 chance of recovery. And once you recovered, you never would get that plague because your body was immune to it. So Christianity also promised a happy afterlife to its followers, something that pagan religions did not. And there was no elaborate initiation. Anyone was welcome, something the mystery religions did not do. But they welcomed, like I say, the thief, the poor, the uneducated, the prostitute, the rich, the successful, anyone. The morality of the pagan world became really bad. Christianity promised better morals. Eventually, the practice of exposing babies was stopped thanks to the influence of Christianity. The practice of gladiatorial fights stopped, again, thanks to the influence of Christianity. Now, regrettably, I'm about out of time, but I want to say this about the fall of the Roman Empire. Why did the Roman Empire fall? Folk, beginning with Marcus Aurelius, the last of the good emperors, Rome began to reverse. During his time, there were plagues, there were storms. A lot of people think, and many people said, oh, it was due to a cooling of the climate. Now, that's more difficult to prove, what the weather was like 1,800 years ago. But we try to figure out from journals, records. They didn't keep accurate weather records, but it appears, though, also where they talked about crop failures, which have been brought about. When the climate cools, you don't realize, you're a farmer, you plant the same crop, and as soon as you get the crop planted, a big frost will hit it and kill it. Or you get the crop in the ground and it comes up, but then the frost comes earlier than it always has and kills the plant anyway. And then you all starve to death in a pile. A cooling climate killed off probably a third of Europe's population during the Black Death. A cooling climate also, we're going to talk about China. China also experienced a population decline. The office of emperor became a disgrace. And eventually you have to dig this up yourself, folks. The barbarians began to come in. Rome had to fight costly wars in the Middle East, costly wars with Persia. And guess what? We're fighting costly wars in the Middle East right now. Wars that are costing us a lot of money and gaining us nothing, except maybe, but the people we have to fight. Same with Rome. They would fight costly wars with Persia that eventually brought down both emperors. Now, what this book does, that no other history book I've seen ever does, they then include chapter 5. Probably in chapter 5 they include something about China. I don't have it in my notes, but your book does include it, folks. You need to know this much about China's history at this point. The main dynasty was the Han Dynasty. I'll try to write that down. The Silk Road joined China to the Mediterranean. And also China experienced a population growth until the year 200, followed by a population decline. Similar to what Europe did. Europe experienced a population growth until, again, I think climate change affected both of them. Then they had a population decline. You need to read in your book, though, what it says about China. Now, about Rome, again, most people agree that Rome fell more from without than within. But the one point I want to make about the fall of Rome, there was a population decline. And I think, very strongly think it was because they simply stopped having babies. While in the meantime, the barbaric neighbors to the north, the Germans, were having babies like crazy. And this is what happens typically to civilized people. You have civilized people surrounded by uncivilized. In most cases, the uncivilized win. Again, the side that wins is usually the side that has the most children. Now, there was a reverse to that. When Europeans came to America in the 15, 16, 1700s, European women were having 10, 12 babies per woman. American Indian women would have about 1 or 2 babies per woman. And then Europeans were getting all these immigrants who kept coming over. And American Indians were not getting that kind of help. So again, pick the winner. It wasn't just that Europeans had guns and horses. The Indians wound up getting those. The Indians were hopelessly outnumbered. All right. Any questions? Now, folks,